Another way of marking the difference between cultural relativism, subjectivism, and objectivist theories is that objectivists think of moral truths as necessary truths, as truths that must be the way that they are. And that's not the way cultural relativists or subjectivists, which they're both just relativists in general, that's not the way that they think about moral truths. For the objectivist, rape is necessarily wrong. Rape just doesn't happen to be wrong. It's got to be wrong. The claim rape is right could never be true. That's a necessary falsehood. But for the cultural relativist and subjectivist, it is possible for the claim rape is right to be true, because what makes it true depends on either the individual, the person making the judgment, or the culture. And as long as the culture approves of it or the individual approves of it, then even though that claim might be false in many cultures and for many persons, it could actually be true, which is one thing the objectivist denies. They say it doesn't matter who's making the moral judgment. It doesn't matter what the culture approves of. That's the sort of act that has to be wrong. Now, when the objectivist is saying this, they are not saying that no one has ever believed that rape is right. I don't know if that's true or not, but they're not talking about what people believe. They're not talking about whether it's even possible to believe that it's right. They're talking about the act itself and its moral status. And they're saying this is the sort of act that has got to be wrong. And that's one thing that really differentiates objectivists from relativists. Instead of it happening to be wrong, like the relativists think, it has got to be wrong. And because of that, because the objectivist thinks of moral truths as necessary truths, there are consequences for how we come to know them, or learn them, or discover them. And we do so not in the way that we discover scientific truths, or more mundane truths, truths of everyday life, like learning or trying to figure out where you misplaced your keys. How you would discover that is probably by walking around the house aimlessly, trying to remember where you were last, where you put them, and hopefully stumbling upon them at some point, rummaging through things. And that sort of knowledge, that way of discovering something, is going to be quite different from how the objectivist thinks we come to know moral truths. Before discussing how the objectivist thinks we acquire knowledge of the moral world, let's first look at the most common source of knowledge, the source of knowledge that people rely on most often, and that is sense experience. Much of our knowledge is acquired through the senses. We know that there are trees in the world, that other people exist, that computers exist, that the sky is blue. And we know those things by relying on observation, the senses. But why? Do we just have this arbitrary predilection for the senses? Or are there lots of different ways of discovering these truths and we just prefer the senses over the others? No, we've got to rely on the senses because those truths are only accessible to sense experience. But then that raises the question, why are they only accessible to sense experience? And the answer is because those truths could have been different than they are. They didn't have to be the way that they are. So if we're in a classroom and I ask you, are there any desks in the room? You would just look. But the reason you have to look is because the classroom could have been empty. The classroom could have had all sorts of things. You need to see which of those numerous possibilities has been realized. Or if we're in the classroom during a class and the door is closed and you can't really see out into the hallway, and I ask you, is there anyone in the hallway? If you can't see anything, if you can't hear anything, you don't know usually. You'd have to get up and go look. The reason being is that there doesn't have to be someone in the hallway. If there is someone in the hallway, that's just a possibility that has been realized. Or the laws of gravity. Objects fall at 9.8 meters per second squared. That's something scientists discovered. But they had to use observation to discover it. Why? Because the world could have developed in such a way that objects fell to the Earth's surface at a different rate. We call these contingent truths. Truths that didn't have to be true, that could have been false. And they're contingent because with regard to the contingent world and contingent truths, there are all sorts of possibilities of how the world could turn out. All sorts of possibilities that are never realized. And given all the possibilities, probably an infinite number of them, we have to use the senses to figure out which possibilities have actually been actualized and which haven't. So if I'm in a coma for over a year and I wake up and I ask you, did the Twins win the World Series while I was in a coma? Well, that's something I need to ask you if I want to find out. I can't just wake up and think about it and think hard and somehow discover the truth of the matter. I need to rely on you, and you would have to either rely on your senses to know that or rely on someone else who told you, and they would have to rely on their senses to figure it out, or they would rely on someone else who told them, and that other person would have to rely on their senses to figure it out. The knowledge that I would acquire would ultimately be traced back to someone's observing the Twins either win or fail to win the World Series. So if I were in a coma and I were to wake up, that would be a question that it makes sense to ask. It wouldn't make sense to ask, though, does 2 + 2 still equal 4? Has anything changed with regard to that while I've been in a coma? No, because there aren't any different possibilities here. There's only one possibility, which is 2 + 2 still equals 4. That's it. So that's not something I need to ask about. There's no way that could have been different than it is. Or suppose that we're looking at Raphael's famous painting, The School of Athens, and in the middle of the painting is supposed to be Plato and Aristotle. Plato is on the left pointing to the heavens, and Aristotle is on the right sort of gesturing toward the ground. And if you were to ask me, well, is that what Plato really looks like? I couldn't figure that out just by thinking and contemplating whether that's what Plato looks like. I'd have to see Plato or see some representation of Plato that was made by someone who actually saw Plato. Because whether Raphael portrayed Plato accurately isn't a necessary truth. He could have failed to. He could have gotten it wrong. And so I would need some access to Plato himself so I could compare the picture with reality. And I need that because it's a contingent truth whether Raphael gives us an accurate depiction of Plato. So for contingent truths, because there are so many different possibilities that could be realized, we have to rely on the senses to figure out which possibilities have obtained, which way the world has been actualized. I said that if I wake up from a coma, I would need to ask whether the Twins won the World Series, if that's something I wanted to know. But I wouldn't have to ask whether 2 + 2 still equals 4, because that would be something that's got to be true, that would remain the same, that it would be impossible that that had changed while I was in a coma. And that leads us to our second source of knowledge, which is that we can know some things just by reason and reflection, apart from sense experience, apart from relying on the senses. But why? Why can we know some things in that way? Well, think about why we have to rely on the senses. We have to rely on the senses when what we're trying to know could have turned out differently than it has, when we're trying to discover contingent truths, when we're trying to discover truths for which there were many different possibilities that could have been realized. If that's the case, then what about those truths that couldn't be any other way, that must be the way that they are, that are necessarily true? Well, then perhaps we could discover those by using reason and reflection. If the fact that truths are contingent requires that we rely on sense experience, maybe if some truths are necessary, we can avoid sense experience and rely on just reason and reflection. Here are some examples of truths that we know independently of sense experience, truths that we know just by reason or reflection. The law of non-contradiction says that something cannot both be and not be at the same time, or a statement cannot be both true and false at the same time. The law of non-contradiction is something we all assume to be true. It's something that even if it's never been pointed out to you, it is in a sense something that you already are committed to, that you believe. And we figured out the law of non-contradiction not because over time we amassed enough experience of things in the world not both existing and not existing at the same time, that we said, oh, I guess that's the way things are, that the law of non-contradiction holds. Because if we knew it on the basis of past experience, then for all we know, there might be parts of the universe where the law of non-contradiction doesn't hold. There might be times in the future when the law of non-contradiction won't hold. But no matter how the world continues to change and develop, even if the laws of nature were to change, one thing that seems to be permanent is that something cannot both be and not be at the same time, or a sentence cannot be both true and false at the same time. It's hard to even conceive of such a state of affairs. If I could somehow tell that the law of non-contradiction holds from sense experience, well, then I'm never seeing an actual contradiction in reality. But what would an actual contradiction look like? How would I verify that using the senses? If the law of non-contradiction can be false, that would mean that the law of non-contradiction can be both true and false at the same time. That wouldn't make much sense. The law of non-contradiction is a precondition of communication. The only way we can understand each other, the only way we can communicate and share information with each other, is because we presuppose that the law of non-contradiction holds. Because if it didn't, all communication would break down right off the bat. So for instance, if you told me that you're majoring in biology, if I thought the law of non-contradiction did not hold, I would possibly infer, oh, so you're not majoring in biology. And you would look at me puzzled and you would say, no, didn't you hear me? I said I'm majoring in biology. And I would infer, oh, so you're not majoring in biology. And you would ask me, what's going on here? Something's not right. And I'd say, well, haven't you heard? The law of non-contradiction doesn't hold. So if you're majoring in biology, it follows that you're not majoring in biology. We wouldn't be able to communicate. You wouldn't be able to communicate the truth to me that you are majoring in biology. Or if your roommate says they're going to the store, or rather if you say to your roommate you're going to the store, and when you get back, your roommate is infuriated and says, where have you been? And you say, well, I told you I was going to the store. And your roommate says, right, so you didn't go to the store. You would find that puzzling as well. Your roommate is assuming that contradictions can be true. Or look at the argument known as modus ponens. This is a valid form of argument, something that you learn in logic. Anytime you use this sort of argument, your argument is a logically good one. So if Ethan is in calculus, then Ethan has taken college algebra. Ethan is in calculus, therefore Ethan has taken college algebra. The premises of this argument is such that if they're true, the conclusion has got to be true. The conclusion can never fail to be true. And that connection between the premises and the conclusion is not just something that happens to be the case, that the world developed and evolved in such a way that this argument turned out valid. It's the sort of argument that has got to be valid. It's the sort of argument that is perfectly truth-preserving no matter what. Well, how did we figure that out? How did logicians figure that out? Well, note what you see with the senses. You don't see the connection. Literally, you don't see the connection between the premises and the conclusion. The connection is called entailment. We say that the premises entail the conclusion. You don't see that. All you really see with the eyes are black squiggles against a light background. And nevertheless, you recognize that if those premises are true, the conclusion would have to be true. How did you figure that out? By using just reason and reflection. Or look at these self-refuting claims. There's something odd in these claims, and we don't learn that just by relying on the senses. So take the claim, deny everything, or you should deny everything. If someone says to you, you should deny everything, they've got a problem, because then that means you should deny their claim that you should deny everything. So they're trying to tell you this is true, and at the same time, they're telling you to deny it. There's a tension there, this internal tension. Or look at the picture that says nothing is written in stone. There's a problem with that claim because it's actually written in stone. There's a internal tension in the claim. There's an internal incoherence. But that's not something we observe with the senses. Consider some other obvious, necessary truths that we just know by reason and reflection. Familiar one from math: if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. Or if A is earlier than B and B is earlier than C, then A is earlier than C. How did they figure that out? Not by performing experiments. It's just open to reason and reflection. Many people believe that an object cannot occupy two completely discrete regions of space at the same time. That seems like something that would be known through reason and reflection. Or how about this? Knowledge is not a lucky guess. This is not something that psychologists discovered or cognitive scientists discovered after they learned quite a lot about the brain. Philosophers have known this for quite some time, because knowledge is just the sort of thing that could never be a lucky guess. Knowledge and a lucky guess are necessarily incompatible. Or the claim that something can't come from nothing. Most of you believe that, but why? Well, your experience seems to confirm that, because you don't find things popping into existence all the time. But if something could come from nothing, it would be puzzling why something never does come from nothing. It would be puzzling that we don't occasionally find something just popping into existence. I suspect that for most of you, you think that you know something can't come from nothing just because if you have nothing, you think, then you couldn't get something. It's not something that you know just because it's never happened to you, but because you rely on reason and reflection. Or how about the truth that necessarily 2 plus 2 equals 4? Not just that 2 plus 2 equals 4, but it necessarily does. Many of you believe that, even if you've really never thought of the concept of necessity. Because if you were to take 1 cup of sugar and 1 cup of water and add them together, you'd probably get 1.5 cups. But I doubt most of you would alter your views of mathematics. I doubt most of you would say, well, I guess 1 plus 1 equals 1.5. Or suppose that you're teaching your child how to add. And you've got 1 block here and 1 block here, and you put them together and you say 1, 2. And then you take them apart, and then you say here's 1 block and here's 1 block, and you put them together and you count 1, 2. But suppose every time you put them together and counted, you counted 1, 2, 3. You thought, well, that's weird. So you pull them apart again. You got 1 block and you got 1 block, and you put them together and you count, and you end up with 1, 2, 3. At that point, I doubt that you would start to scratch your head and wonder, maybe mathematics has changed. Maybe 1 plus 1 does equal 3. Instead, you'd probably tell your child to go get their mom and dad because you're probably having a stroke. You would think something's going wrong in my brain. It's not that mathematics has changed. Something's going on up here that's causing me to miss this necessary truth. I'm hallucinating an extra block somehow. If you thought that mathematics could really change, then you wouldn't be compelled to say, you know what, I might be having a stroke right now. Something's going wrong in my brain. You might just think, hey, this is it. It happened finally. Math changed. 1 plus 1 now equals 3.